Thank you for waiting. My name is Christy Zono, and I'm the Director of Genetics and Health Policy at Genetic Alliance. Welcome to today's webinar, Genetic Testing in a Changing Regulatory Landscape. This is an informational webinar in the Genetic Alliance's Hot Topics and Genetics and Advocacy series. We're very happy to have all of you with us today, and our speakers are going to launch us into an exploration of FDA regulation of in vitro diagnostic tests and the potential impact of these regulatory initiatives on access to diagnostic tests, including genetic tests. Then the second part of our program is reserved for what we expect to be a lively question and answer period. In addition, the slides from today's webinar are available on the Genetic Alliance website at geneticalliance.org. So on to our speakers. I'd like to introduce Jeff Gibbs and Paul Rudensky. Jeff Gibbs is the director of Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara, where he's represented healthcare companies on FDA-related matters since 1984. Paul Rudensky is a partner in the law firm McDermott, Will, and Emery, and serves in the Health Law Department, concentrating his practice in life sciences. Both of our presenters today have a wealth of experience in this field, and their full bios are available on our website. So a big thank you to both Jeff and Paul for joining us today, and without further delay, I'll turn it over to Jeff to get us started.
Great, thank you very much. What I want to do today is talk about FDA regulation of diagnostic products. There are a lot of different aspects to this. It's a complicated area. Paul and I are going to try to cover what could take days to discuss, and that is FDA regulation of diagnostic products, and trying to focus particularly on topical issues and some of the changes that are occurring with FDA. It is a time of transition right now, and so without further ado, I want to start talking about FDA and how it regulates diagnostic products. The definition of diagnostic products, it's a product intended to be used in diagnosis of a disease or other condition. And these products are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. And one of the important issues that we'll be talking about is the extent to which FDA regulates diagnostic products and services. Briefly put, there are two different ways in which these products and services are offered. One is through kits that are sold by manufacturers to laboratories, and those kinds of products are regulated by FDA. The other is as services that are offered by laboratories called laboratory-developed tests, and Paul and I will be talking about that more. FDA clearly has the authority to regulate kits, and I want to talk about that first. There's more of a controversy about FDA's authority to regulate laboratory-developed tests and what role, if any, FDA should play in that area. The term diagnose is given a very broad definition and construction by FDA. So people will see the word diagnose and think that it's limited to a product that is intended to actually render a diagnosis. And that's not really the case. It could also include tests that are screening or for prognosis or for monitoring. So when it comes to the question of does FDA have jurisdiction over a, quote, diagnostic product, people shouldn't focus on the word diagnostic and think that it's got a limited meaning. It really is. It would also include screening, prognosis, monitoring, prediction, and the like. And testing for genetic traits would fall within the definition of a device, given this broad scope of the definition. So even though the genetic trait might be a predisposition or a marker, rather than diagnosing a disease, that should be enough to, if it's sold as a kit, to give FDA jurisdiction. The next question is who regulates these kinds of kits? Within the FDA, there are the FDA is divided into centers, and different centers have different ways of doing business and operating. The two centers that are involved here are the Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research and the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. The overwhelming majority of diagnostic products go to the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And within that, it goes to the Office of In Vitro Diagnostic Safety and Effectiveness, or OIVD. So OIVD is going to be the part of FDA that will have primary jurisdiction over the kinds of products that we will be talking about. And they play by far the most active role in regulatory issues relating to diagnostics. The jurisdiction is largely intended by intended use, a concept that I will discuss. Intended use is a pivotal term. It's from a regulatory standpoint, one of the key definitions and key concepts. The intended use of the product is governed by what the company says about not how it's used, but what the company is intending for the test to be used for, as defined by the objective expressed intent of the company. So you could have a genetic test which is looking for a marker, and the intended use is defined by the company in a narrow way, and then it can be defined more broadly, perhaps by the marketplace, by doctors or laboratorians using the test off-label. The intended use from a regulatory standpoint is still governed by what the company says, not by how the product is used. And intended use is very important because it can determine whether a product is regulated by FDA or not, and if so, how. And there are two major ways that new diagnostic products get on the market through FDA. One is called the 510K pre-market notification, and the other is called the pre-market approval application, or PMA. PMAs are much more complicated than 510Ks, and depending how a company frames the intended use, the product may be 510K or it may be PMA, which may make the difference between whether the product is commercially viable and ever enters the market, or is going to be so costly the company will not develop it. In some cases, the intended use is governed simply by what the marker is. In some cases, there is flexibility about how that intended use is framed. And also, the intended use will determine what kinds of studies need to be conducted, whether it be a large scale versus small scale, prospective versus retrospective. So it is a very, very important regulatory concept. And you'll note when FDA clears or approves a kit, a test, that it will be clearing or approving for a very specific intended use. Just last week, the FDA cleared a test for ovarian cancer. And if you look at the FDA press release and the company's press release, you'll see how carefully defined and how complicated that intended use is. Intended use is often very carefully negotiated with FDA at the end of the process. The intended use will also affect reimbursement. Paul can talk about that, being a leading expert in that field. It's important that the intended use match the clinical data and the study population. So companies are forced to think about what the intended use is early on when they begin doing the study. And I think one of the mistakes that people often make is they'll discuss a test and say, it's a cancer test, or it's a lung cancer test, or it's a genetic marker for predisposition to lung cancer. Those are general kinds of statements, but they're not the way the FDA frames them. It's very important that for companies that the intended use be carefully considered at the outset and then match up with the study design. Some of the very convoluted intended use statements that you see relate to the fact that companies are trying to be consistent with the study population and FDA regulatory requirements. They may not be clinically the most logical, but they're something that is a necessary outcome of the current regulatory structure. And then once the product is cleared or approved for marketing, the intended use will govern what the company can say about it. So to sum up, intended use is a key concept. It determines whether 510K or PMA, that is short-term process, relatively short-term versus very long-term, what data needs to be collected, reimbursement, and what kinds of claims, among other things. Thus far, there are only a handful of genetic tests that have gone through the FDA process. Others surely will. There are others that are going through the process now, and others that are being studied to go through the FDA process. But whether a test is genetic or something else does not matter. It's going to go through the same kind of review process. So whether you're looking for a genetic marker or you're diagnosing a disease that's a result of a genetic trait, or there's no genetic involvement at all, the processes are going to be the same. And the kinds of routes you have are the PMA, the 510K pre-market notification, de novo reclassification, investigational use only, research use only, and laboratory developed tests. Strictly speaking, investigational use only, research use only are not FDA pathways to them through FDA, but they are ways to get products on the market. And then laboratory developed tests are historically not regulated by FDA. Companies that are getting involved in the diagnostic area are entering a very complicated arena. And for new tests, they're going to have to get clinical data. Companies, therefore, will want to know at an early stage what kind of studies they have to do, because they don't want to spend millions of dollars to do a study and then find out from FDA that, in fact, the agency wants something completely different. So companies will often try to meet with FDA, at least for novel products. For a routine kind of well-defined product like a glucose test, where FDA has literally cleared hundreds of them, that's not necessary. But if you're looking for a novel kind of diagnostic product, then companies should go to FDA and try to get some kind of feedback. And the way they do this is something called a pre-IDE submission. Hearing that phrase, you might think that it's a precursor to submitting an IDE, which stands for Investigational Device Exemption. In fact, in the FDA world, companies submit pre-IDEs never expecting to actually submit an IDE. It is a way of getting feedback on the mechanism that FDA uses. One of the challenges that companies have is they'll meet with FDA, submit a pre-IDE, get the FDA feedback, and then sometimes, unfortunately, FDA's views will change. Sometimes that's due to science, sometimes new regulations, sometimes new developments in related areas. Sometimes it's due to changes in personnel at FDA or just new thinking. Particularly for those latter situations, it can become very difficult for companies that have done a study in a certain way and now found out that they need to do it in a different way. And that is an ongoing issue. And data requirements have changed over time. That's not surprising as science evolves and we learn more that FDA would expect more data, different kinds of data. And in general, the trend has been for the agency to require more data for companies to get through the process. The level of FDA regulation is linked to the level of risk associated with the product. And generally, products are put into three classes. Class 1 are the low risks. Those generally don't need 510Ks, and they may or may not need to meet good manufacturing practice regulation or GMP. GMPs are designed to ensure that the products will work reliably and meet their specifications and give the same kinds of results time after time without variability due to product differences and because it's made differently. That's one of the principal goals of GMPs. Class 2 devices are moderate risk, and those will almost always involve 510Ks, and they are always subject to GMP. Glucose is an example. They may also need to meet special controls, and special controls are extra regulatory standards established by FDA. Might deal with labeling, it might deal with manufacturing, it might deal with additional testing, and the goal is to have a higher level of confidence that the product will meet its design specifications and performance characteristics. And then the third category is Class 3, which is the highest risk, and those are ones where PMAs are required. Tests for human papillomavirus would fall into that. So would tests that are used for screening for cancer, those will routinely be put in PMA. As I've mentioned, there's a big difference between Class 2 and Class 3. For most novel diagnostics, they're going to be Class 2 or Class 3. Class 1 will not be the standard, will not be the classification for any of the new markers that are clinically significant. So really the area we're looking at is a Class 2 versus Class 3. The 510K pre-market notification is the most common route to market. If you look at all devices that are reviewed by FDA, roughly 98 to 99% go through the 510K process. So it is the standard method for products entering. In order to get a 510K, companies need to show substantial equivalence to a predicate device. Those are terms of art, substantial equivalence and predicate device. A predicate device is either a product that was on the market before May 28, 1976, which was when the medical device amendments took effect, or one that was cleared by FDA since then through 510K. Obviously, the products that are entering the market now are going to rely much, much more heavily on products that have been cleared by FDA rather than being shown equivalent to products on the market before May 28, 1976. So really what you're looking for as a company looking for a 510K is showing equivalence to a product that's been cleared by FDA. And then PMA products cannot be used as predicates. It's a common misunderstanding that once a product's been approved by FDA through a PMA, then other companies can 510K. That's not true. Everyone else has to PMA unless they go through reclassification, which is where FDA would decide that products should move from Class 3 to Class 2. That's something that happens, although it's a very long, slow process. For substantial equivalence, a key part is showing the same intended use. There's some flexibility and latitude, but it has to be pretty similar to the predicate device. The technology can be very different. So In diagnostics, you're seeing this tremendous explosion of new techniques, and it would have been very difficult for patients and companies if FDA said the new technologies and new methods made it impossible to use the 510K process. In fact, that's not happened. Companies are able to use all sorts of novel methods, and as long as it's the same intended use, they will have to prove that the results are accurate, the product is safe and effective, but the new technology does not stand in the way of 510K clearance, which is a very important policy decision. Clinical data will be required for new types of tests, and laboratory test data is routinely required for diagnostics. It may not be clinical data, but FDA will want to see that if you give the same test to different laboratories, so they'll get the same results, or if you give it to different technicians, that they'll get the same results in the same sample. So you have to show that the test does work. There's some people who believe that these tests enter the market without data, and that is not correct. And once a 510K is submitted, FDA has several options. It can find a substantial equivalent, which means the product can be marketed. It can say that it's not substantially equivalent, which in effect means reject it. It can ask for more information, and if it does that, then there's a 90-day review cycle. The initial review is 90 days, and then each additional cycle is 90 days, up to 3. There will not be a fourth review cycle. At that point, FDA will reject the 510K. And delays or requests for data can become time-consuming and costly. For the novel 510Ks that are going through FDA now, typically it's taking a couple of rounds to get through. So even though on paper it looks like it should be a 90-day review cycle, for novel products it's not at all likely that they will get through on that first round, and it could take a year or more to go through the FDA 510K process. De novo is an interesting technique that FDA has for a product where it's low or moderate risk, and there's no predicate device. So FDA can go through the process, say, we find your product to be moderate risk. There's no predicate device, so we cannot find a substantial equivalent, but we can go through the de novo reclassification, which means that you don't have to submit a PMA. We can clear it as a 510K instead. And that's been a huge boon for diagnostics. Of the de novo products approved by FDA, around half of them have been diagnostics. Most recently, the ovarian cancer test cleared just last week. Circulating tumor cells was another one, and there have been more. Office in Vitro Diagnostics is very good about looking for opportunities to use the de novo process. When a product is cleared through de novo, there are special controls that are put in place, and those tell other companies what they need to do. It really opens up the pathway for other companies to submit their own 510Ks for the same kind of intended use. So the first company through is really clearing the path for other companies that would like to have a similar kind of product. And it is a good tool for innovative products that FDA has used, not as much as I'd like to see, but has used relatively often. Pre-market approval, or PMA, it's a much longer, more complicated process. Briefly, it's always going to require clinical data. The submission is going to be much larger, in part because it needs GMP information. It's a 180-day review cycle instead of the 90. For the first panel, for the first kind of test to go through the FDA process, there's an advisory panel, the public advisory panel review. Always a pre-approval GMP inspection. FDA will often go out to the sites which do the study to monitor them. In some, it takes much more time. It's much more costly than 510Ks. And once companies get approval, they have less flexibility in making changes. So, for example, if there's a mutation in a cancer and they want to modify the product, it's much harder to do that with a PMA product than a 510K. In general, companies are going to strongly prefer the 510K route. And in some cases, unfortunately, for diagnostics, the market is so small that if a PMA is required, it's just not going to be financially viable, and it really will mean that the product is not going to be made available because of the cost and the long timelines for PMAs. Investigational use only is a classification to allow products to be studied by clinical investigators to determine performance characteristics. It's a good vehicle for generating clinical data. Manufacturers can charge for IUO products, and the products must be labeled as IUO. manufacturers do need to receive some data back from the investigators. There are some companies that have essentially just labeled the product IUO but have not conducted studies. That's not the correct use of the product. It should be used in a study to get data. It does not necessarily have to be safety and effectiveness data. It can be population data, demographic data, or other kinds of information that would help characterize performance. But it does need to be used for the purposes of generating some data. Usually, IVDs, in vitro diagnostics, that are studied this way do not have to get FDA approval. For many devices, you do have to get FDA permission before beginning the study. But because diagnostic studies are low risk, ordinarily you don't need FDA approval. And there may be only a half dozen studies each year which get FDA approval with diagnostics before they begin. The companies will generally need to get approval from an institutional review board or more than one IRB to protect the welfare of subjects who participate. Sometimes the samples that are used come from anonymized specimens, and so in those cases the requirements will be less, and there may or may not need to be IRB approval in those situations. But it's an important vehicle for companies to, and the means by which they get data to demonstrate that a test works. Research use only products are ones that are intended for basic scientific research, or learn more about biology, or try to find out whether a marker has some clinical utility. Companies cannot claim that it's safe or effective. It is really a research tool, and at that point there should not be any statements that the product has been shown to be safe, effective, or has diagnostic utility. Laboratory developed tests, or LDTs, are the other major category. LDTs predate FDA regulation of devices. The medical device amendments were passed in 1976. Lab developed tests go back well before then. FDA from 1976 to 1992 never said anything about regulating LDTs. In 92, it said for the first time that it did have the authority to regulate lab tests. And I filed a citizen petition with FDA challenging the agency's legal authority to do that. It took 5 years, but FDA responded in a Federal Register notice saying that it did have the authority to regulate lab tests. And then it responded to me formally in 1998, so it took 6 years to get the response saying that we do have the authority. And according to FDA, all lab-developed tests are medical devices and therefore subject to full device regulation. Although FDA said this in 92, that it had the authority to regulate lab tests, it wasn't until a few years ago that FDA began to exercise the power. And then it told a couple of companies that what they were doing was subject to FDA jurisdiction. There's been a clear trend for FDA to exercise that power more frequently. The letter that it sent to LabCorp last fall involving its OvaSure cancer diagnostic test is clear evidence of FDA doing that. There have been letters that FDA has sent to labs that are offering direct access testing to patients, asking for more information. There have been letters sent to labs offering H1N1 or swine flu testing. I've been working with companies that are offering lab tests, and FDA is seeking more information about those tests and seems to be trying to consider whether it ought to regulate these tests. So it has become an area where FDA, which had left alone for many years, but now is exercising far more clout. One of the big issues is how much work does the lab have to do for a test to be considered an LDT. If what a lab has done is offer a test, not gotten FDA approval, and it's not an LDT, FDA, in the case of LabCorp, said that's not legal and we're going to regulate you. The vast majority of genetic tests, by the way, are LDTs. The last study I saw said roughly 1,300. I'm sure it's more than that are being offered now. Only a handful of these have been cleared by FDA. FDA's jurisdiction, or attempt to exercise jurisdiction over LDTs and lab tests generally, has created some confusion, which has had an impact on fundraising and marketing, and et cetera. And there's a possibility of more change. There could be new legislation, or Genentech filed a citizen petition with FDA last December seeking that FDA regulate a wide number of LDTs. FDA responded by saying it would look into the matter further. There's been no response to that. In some, this area is in a state of flux. And then there's the IVD-MIA products. Basically what you have here is multiple analytes taken together which generate a score which FDA says makes it into a device subject to the full panoply of FDA regulation. There's been considerable opposition to that concept, and Genetic Alliance weighed in on this, and there are a lot of organizations that's a flawed idea. But it has been talked about a lot by the agency. I put question mark about current status. Maybe Paul's heard something more recently. But someone said yesterday they've heard it's been pulled. I've not heard that. It has a lot of challenges, and it was not the best thought-out concept that FDA has ever introduced. So finally, IVDs represent a very large and growing area. IVDs are extremely important to healthcare improvements, to better use of drugs, to better outcomes. The regulatory landscape there has become more complicated. FDA is changed its thinking over the years. It continues to evolve in general in the direction of requiring more data and more information. Unfortunately, to some degree, regulatory uncertainties still exist, and the predictability about what FDA wants and how the process will work is still somewhat elusive. But many companies are successfully navigating the process as shown by the most recent clearance. And with that, I'll turn it over to Paul.
Great. Thank you, Jeff, for taking us through all of that. Certainly a complex issue and complex process. So we'll now turn it over to Paul to continue our discussion.
First, I just want to apologize to everyone. I am a little bit webinar challenged this morning. I had a change in my travel plan, so I'm sequestered in a corner of a small restaurant, so I'm trying to do my best not to have the background noise interfere. But picking up on what Jeff discussed, I want to talk a little bit about the changing regulatory landscape. Genetic Alliance has actually been very involved in trying to address the concerns that were raised by FDA's moving forward with the IVD-MIA guidance, but in a way that tries to recognize that there are changes and different implications of applying regulatory concepts that apply to kits for more traditional IVDs to more complex diagnostics, especially those that are laboratory-developed tests. Currently, as Jeff raised, there have been some attempts to kind of expand out and look at FDA's regulation in this area of genetic and genomic testing. And within the current law, the current framework, we have the IVD-MIA draft guidance that Jeff mentioned, which had a number of issues about the definitions, a number of issues about how it would actually operate if these laboratories that really are not medical product manufacturers are now required to comply with all of the manufacturing requirements, and also you no longer have the separation between a manufacturer and a laboratory being a licensed provider, just like physicians or hospitals that have certain flexibility with respect to how they use medical devices, that there are a number of questions when the laboratory is both the licensed provider as well as the manufacturer. At the same time that FDA came out with the IVD-MIA guidance, they came out with with the draft guidance related to analyte-specific reagents. These are often monoclonal antibodies or other pieces that are used to develop laboratory-develed tests. They're not tests in of themselves. Those pieces are regulated by FDA, and there's been a number of issues about FDA's intent in this area over the years, and FDA issued a final guidance on this in September 2007. That also had a fair amount of controversy and has caused some disruption in the supply of these reagents, these pieces of laboratory tests. There are some other guidance documents that have come out. When FDA clears a new test through the de novo pathway that Jeff mentioned, as a response to that, they will subsequently issue a guidance document as a special control, and they did for the gene expression test for breast cancer, MammaPrint, that was released in early 2008, and they released a special controls guidance document explaining what FDA's thoughts were about how those types of tests could be cleared by FDA. There are other pharmacogenomic and genetic guidances, including pharmacogenomic and testing for heritable disorders that FDA has issued as well. In addition, within the current regulatory framework, there are a number of different reports. There have been recent technology assessments about laboratory-developed tests, one in draft form that the Agency for Healthcare for Disease Control and Molecular Testing kind of guidelines or standards, kind of good laboratory practices for genetic testing. So there is currently, within the current framework, some regulatory guidance about how these tests should be developed and how these tests should be performed. But there is still a gap because there are concerns about if any laboratory that is CLIA certified, state licensed, can open up a laboratory and develop a test, and it's the laboratory director that gets to review and determine whether or not they have adequate data to support the claims. Is there additional oversight that is required? And I should mention that most laboratories that will be performing genomic testing that accept specimens nationwide are required to be licensed in New York. If you accept specimens in New York or are located in New York, you're licensed in New York. And New York does have a pre-market review requirement, so it's not as if there is no oversight beyond the laboratory director and whatever the CLIA inspectors see. Plus, many of these labs are CAP accredited or accredited by the Joint Commission, where there are greater oversight than the minimum requirements that there are under CLIA. To address some of these concerns about gaps, there have been a number of legislative proposals in the last Congress. Late Senator Kennedy, together with former Senator Smith, introduced a bill, S736, in the last Congress, which would have regulated all laboratory-developed tests as medical devices, and then would have required submission of some information, and then essentially would have called on FDA to determine what would or would not have required various levels of pre-market review. Separately, former Senator Obama, now President Obama, together with Senator Burr from North Carolina, had a bipartisan genomics bill which went much more broadly than simply looking at regulatory framework for these tests, to look at an HHS-wide kind of framework to look and promote genetic and genomic testing, development of biodatabank. But part of that legislation did have looking at what requirements should be for regulation and setting up what they called a decision matrix for the Secretary, essentially to triage between what should be under CLIA and what should be under FDA. Obviously, this is from the last Congress, so neither of these move forward. Representative Patrick Kennedy, Senator Kennedy's son, who's a representative from Rhode Island, had the House complement to the Obama-Burr bill look very similar, but we understand that he's making changes to that and plans to introduce something shortly, and we know that that will include a registry of genetic and genomic tests, which is something that many, many stakeholders have called for, including the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Genetics, Health, and Society, and that's something also that the Genetic Alliance has supported. And then there are other possible bills. A number of offices are interested in personalized medicine. A number of working groups who work in this area have been working on possible legislative proposals. Several industry groups have also looked at proposals. The American Clinical Laboratory Association, which is the association of major independent laboratories, all of which are certified under CLIA, has come up with a framework, met with Commissioner Hamburg earlier this week to talk about their framework. That essentially keeps the jurisdiction for regulation of these tests under CLIA, under CMS, but has a substantial consultative role of FDA to provide information and expertise to CMS. AdvaMed, which is the Medical Device Trade Association, working kind of within that framework, has submitted to FDA its proposal for a risk-based framework under the least burdensome authority, which essentially says to FDA, you need to put in whatever standards you think are appropriate, but where there are choices, you should pick the least burdensome so that there can be access to new technologies. The Coalition for 21st Century Medicine, where both Jeff and I participate, and the Genetic Alliance is a member, has come up with some risk-based advanced diagnostic-specific proposals. We submitted something to the docket on the IVD-MIA guidance in late 2007, actually at HHS's request. The principal components of that proposal were to have a registry where we would be able to gather information about these tests so we would know how many there are, what the scope of them, who's performing them, but most importantly, what data supports the claims that are made. And then based on that, a evidence-based framework for regulation could be developed rather than simply trying to fit these into the current IVD framework as medical devices. And then there are other proposals, other groups that we are aware of are working on. Recognizing the opportunity with the new administration, the Genetic Alliance, together with Genetic and Public Policy Center at Johns Hopkins, the Coalition for 21st Century Medicine, and in total 106 groups, many of whom were Genetic Alliance members, sent a letter to Secretary Sebelius the day after she was confirmed, outlining some core principles for regulation of advanced diagnostics and requesting an opportunity to run through these with the new secretary. And I'll go over the three key principles now. The first was that oversight of all advanced diagnostics, including test kits and laboratory-developed tests, should be risk-based and built on an expanded advanced scientific capabilities within the department, including collaboration within HHS agencies as well as extramural, so that the regulation can be science-based, and also key that any change in regulation should be done through notice and comment rulemaking. There are a number who have said that takes too long, but this is an area of critical importance. And an area of critical importance can't just make up on the fly, can't simply have agency. I think we really need to have an informed dialogue back and forth on the record so that whatever the legal requirements are, it's been well vetted, well thought out. The second principle is for registry, that a registry should be developed and maintained that includes the name of the laboratory performing the test, the name of who developed the test, and information to support both analytical validity and clinical validity of the specific test or method, and that submission should be mandatory. Many of the stakeholders in discussing this have kind of coalesced about the idea of a database very similar to clinicaltrials.gov, which is managed by the National Institutes of Health, but this would be one for advanced genetic testing data. Lastly, the third principle that was in the letter to Secretary Sebelius called for strengthening of CLIA to make sure that diagnostic testing is accurate, reliable, and timely, and also to make sure that whatever the requirements are under CMS, insofar as there may be enhanced requirements under FDA, that those be harmonized so that you don't have to have two people inspecting a laboratory, duplicate paperwork requirements where that's not necessary. So the 3 points, again, are for notice and comment rulemaking based on science, looking at experts from HHS-wide. Second, a registry so that we will learn more about these tests and what makes them tick and what supports the performance characteristics that are laid out by the laboratory. And third, enhancements to CLIA, which is, in fact, the historical and the agency and program that Congress established to assure quality of laboratory testing. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the moderator.
Okay, the first one, I think this came in during Jeff, but I'm sure either of you can answer these questions that are coming in. The question is, what about laboratory tests that are not FDA regulated? Who regulates what the company says about intended use of tests?
This is Jeff. They are subject to regulation under multiple levels. First, as Paul mentioned, there's the CLIA, and companies do need to, laboratories do need to comply with CLIA. There are also state requirements, New York being one, California having an active program. There are also regulations imposed by the Federal Trade Commission, which have to do with truthful and accuracy of statements, and so companies who make statements that violate the Federal Trade Commission Act would be subject to FTC action, investigation. In fact, that has occurred with at least some lab tests. And then there are state regulatory agencies, which would be equivalent to FTC or the attorney generals of those states, where states would have laws that protect consumers from deception or misleading or false kinds of statements. So there are other agencies. And then beyond that, there are professional societies that do have some role to play in the overseeing of this, although it would not be a formal legal approach such as the FTC or the states would take. Paul, you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, just two things. One is that I think it's important for folks to understand that the Federal Trade Commission standard is not a de minimis standard. It really focuses on there being transparency and substantiation of claims made consistent with what experts in the relevant fields believe is the kind of state of the art of the evidence. So it's not a de minimis standard, but it is a reactive standard. It is not one that has a pre-market review. You don't have to go to the Federal Trade Commission to pre-clear.
Okay, Jeff, this one was related to something that was a specific thing from your slide. The question is, why are serological reagents for EEV considered Class 1 or low risk? Is it because they're for veterinary applications?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure I know the answer. The classification regulations were done a long time ago. It's not one that I've ever used. It's one of the fewer ones that are in the Class 1 category, and I picked it because, in fact, it doesn't seem to be used much, and it's not terribly important. But no, it would not be veterinary. Veterinary diagnostic devices are not regulated by FDA through the 510K process. Veterinary devices are subject to enforcement action if it's false or misleading, but it's not because this is a vet device.
Okay, thank you. The next one is for either of you. Can you comment on the ability of the FDA to evaluate complex genetic testing? I'm concerned that those reviewing these tests may not have the appropriate knowledge base to evaluate the testing appropriately.
This is Paul. Obviously, the FDA is the science-based agency and does have a lot of expertise within OIVD, and they also have folks that they can reach out to more broadly, both within the agency and outside the agency. But I do think that one of the reasons you see the types of claims that we've seen with these advanced tests reflects the struggle that FDA has over its comfort level and understanding of these advanced diagnostics. So when you get to certain claims like prognostic claims, does the test predict an outcome? FDA is much more comfortable with that than they are with claims that are, from my perspective, more informative to physicians, which are how do you use the test then in managing a patient? And FDA has struggled a lot with that, and we have had a difficult time in many tests being able to figure out a pathway to FDA clearance or approval for those types of claims. So I think FDA does have, certainly a substantial amount of expertise, is expanding that expertise, but there are, clearly are areas that they're less comfortable with in this space than in other areas that they've dealt with for many years.
And I think that one of the challenges for FDA is that the rate of change here in development is just astonishing. And so you have people at FDA who have been working there for many years and know some areas very well, but they haven't been able to keep up with all the technological developments, and also they don't always have the clinical expertise. So they're now seeing diagnostic tests being used in ways that they have never envisioned and are not particularly familiar with. The FDA does have the ability to tap into experts from elsewhere. So Office in Vitro Diagnostics will sometimes bring in people from the Center for Drugs who are more familiar with a particular disease, and I've been at meetings where there's someone from Center for Drugs who's been invited particularly for that reason. Also, FDA can go outside the agency to get external help. For example, on 510Ks, they'll sometimes have a mini panel where they'll send out the 510K or parts of the 510K to 3 reviewers and ask them for comments. And they can also get help from advisory panel for PMAs and for the occasional 510K. But clearly it is an issue for FDA. They're aware of it. The resources have expanded. But for FDA to keep up with the science is going to be quite a challenge, and the rate of innovation is probably going to outstrip the FDA's ability to add personnel who are knowledgeable about these different fields. So it's going to be an ongoing battle for the agency.
Okay, the next question is, what are your concerns about how over-regulation will stop innovation?
Well, there are several reasons why I would be concerned. One is the ability to get funding, and you could see that very clearly after FDA issued the IVDMI draft guidance. Simply doing that created uncertainty, and investors do not like uncertainty.
Direct access, direct-to-consumer testing where patients can self-test without necessarily having a professional order the test and report out the results is an area that is of concern, and that FDA is looking at that.
I just want to echo what Paul said there at the end, that FDA is certainly showing a lot more interest in direct access, and that they've made a conscious policy choice a couple of years ago to view it in general as an area of less regulatory significance, and that there's been a policy shift on that. So some of the inaction that we've seen may change in the future as FDA focuses on some of these companies.
Okay, this next one is bringing us back to the FDA guidance. It says, can you comment on the Mammopride approval under IVD-MIA? It seems that it was unusually rapid. Was this to prove a point about IVD-MIA's workability? And is it unusual to see a diagnostic device's approval under non-final draft guidance?
A couple things. First of all, the rapidity of the final clearance doesn't reflect the full time that it takes a sponsor to go through and negotiate with FDA about what will be required and to pull all of those data together. And that, in Agendia's case, took well in excess of a year, 18 months. That's one. Second, a guidance is a guidance, and it is not in and of itself legally enforceable. So FDA could accept and approve IVD-MIAs whether or not it had come out with a draft or final guidance on those. We know that there was a enforcement position, at least in the former administration, not to enforce those entities that would be distributing IVD-MIAs until they finalize the guidance, but there's nothing about the guidance per se that would prohibit FDA either from clearing those without a guidance or from taking enforcement action in the absence of a guidance.
Yeah, I think it's very important to on the Agendia example, to clarify the myth that spread that it was rapid. And some people have talked about how it was a 30-day review cycle. Agendia did get clearance right before the FDA panel meeting to talk about IVD-MIAs. FDA said that was not that was purely coincidental, unlikely that it was accidental timing. But one thing that is absolutely without dispute is that there were submissions earlier by Agendia, and although the final review time from the last submission to clearance apparently took only about 30 days, there had been, as Paul said, a lot of discussion, a lot of back and forth before that happened, and that whole period should count. When you're talking about time to market, cost to market delays, that's all relevant time. It's not just how long it took the last submission to get through the agency.
Okay, and then the last one is just about balance. How do you balance the need for regulation and data with the potential benefit from getting a test to the market quickly?
Yeah, that's been an issue for FDA ever since it was founded, and it's not limited to diagnostics. You run into the exact same issue with drugs, with devices that are therapeutic as well as diagnostic. And the balance has to be struck based on the individual product, the clinical importance, what are the what are the benefits, what are the risks associated with it, what are the alternatives, what can be done to mitigate the risk. Change that FDA has been looking at is looking at more post-market surveillance. We know that products, when they enter the market, there's often very little information about them, that whether you're talking about drugs, devices, or in vitro diagnostics, the testing process is somewhat constrained necessarily by the regulatory requirements, and that you can get useful information post-market. So when people are talking about the balance to be struck, it's not just the balance of what based on the data at the time, it's what can be done post-approval or post-clearance to get additional data to further calibrate risk benefits and make the test one, or the device for the drug, one that is more useful and has a better risk-benefit ratio.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jeff and Paul, for joining us today and your great presentations and responses to all the wonderful questions that we got from the participants. And just on your screen are just some reminders that the session materials are available on the Genetic Alliance website.
Thanks very much for hosting us.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank
All right,
you.
have a good day, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.